Hello and welcome to True North's live election night show. It is our great pleasure to have you tuned in as we break down a really exciting night for the province of Alberta. We have municipal elections across the province, from Calgary and Edmonton to Red Deer to Grand Prairie, right down to Bentley and Dutchess. And if you have to point those out on a map, we can get to that as the night goes on. We also have Senate nominee elections. We have referenda at the provincial level and also at the municipal level. Then we have, more importantly, a great cast of characters to help get us through this evening. My friend, colleague, and boss, Candice Malcolm, True North's founder and senior fellow, is here, as well as William Macbeth, who normally works behind the scenes as True North's managing director, but has decided to emerge from the shadows and join us as our chief Alberta correspondent this evening. William, Candice, thanks for joining us on this great adventure through Alberta's elections. It's good to have you both here.
Great. Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Andrew. I particularly enjoyed your description of William, who is our resident Albertan. It's funny because we have a lot of people on the True North team. Some people like myself, I lived in Alberta for many years. I went to the University of Alberta and I lived in Calgary after I graduated, but I don't live in Alberta. So William is our sort of token Albertan on staff, and he's here to help us make sense of everything going on in that wonderful province you live in, William. So it's great to have you here.
Excited for the night.
So let's start, William, with the lay of the land here of what's actually being voted on. I tried to give the top line description here, but we have a lot of things happening today.
You're absolutely right. So across the province, in every municipality, we're having municipal elections. So people voting for mayors and reeves and county councillors and city councillors. But on top of that, Albertans are also voting in several referenda. There's a referenda to remove equalization from the Constitution. Many Albertans feel that this is an unfair program that penalizes Alberta and transfers a lot of money to the rest of the Federation, sometimes inappropriately so. Albertans are being asked to vote on that. They're being asked whether or not they want to move permanently to daylight savings time. And I actually think it will confuse a lot of people when they discover that they'll never really know what time it is in Alberta anymore. But a lot of people feel very strongly on that. They really don't like that spring ahead. And Calgarians are voting whether or not to put fluoride back in their water. And so a lot of people don't know fluoride was taken out of Calgary water about 10 years ago. They're being asked to put it in. Now, on top of that, they're also being asked to choose Senate nominees. Alberta traditionally has elected its Senate representatives and has done so for the last 30 years. But the prime minister of the day doesn't always choose to appoint those people. And it has been not a coincidence that conservative prime ministers are much more likely to respect the democratic wishes of Albertans than liberal prime ministers.
Well, that's a great rundown of what's happening, William. Thanks for that. Let me turn to you on this, Candice, from a True North perspective. You mentioned earlier that we're not all from Alberta here. I know we love the province. We've all done a lot of work in Alberta, covering Alberta. Why are we doing this show? Why is it important that we have all the people together that we're going to have tonight?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. The first is that we have fun doing these live shows. We did a couple during the election, and they're just a great way to connect with our audience, to connect with the country, really, to have try to have our finger on the pulse of what's going on out there. And, you know, during the election, every time we spoke to people from Alberta, they sort of emphasized that these elections were coming. And in some ways, they were, I will say, more consequential, because obviously whoever the prime minister and whoever is running the country has a huge impact on everyone in the country. However, Albertans didn't really feel like they were going to have their voice heard in the federal election, and they didn't. They by and large voted Conservative, and we still got a Liberal prime minister. So to many of the people that we were talking to in Alberta, they sort of said, you know, these are the ones that we feel like we will have our voice heard. And it's sort of interesting, William, to hear you say, talk a little bit about how Alberta elects its own senators, because you're right, that's not something that's respected. We don't see Justin Trudeau, the prime minister, appointing the democratically elected senators in Alberta. He instead chooses to vote to appoint his own independent senators who are really just liberals. And so it's interesting that there's another element here with the equalization. I'll say that is another big reason why we wanted to cover this, because it's so interesting. I've been writing about equalization for a very, very long time, and the system doesn't feel fair. It never has. It doesn't make a lot of sense, especially in this environment where everyone is suffering from a strained healthcare system. Everyone needs more resources, every province. And so the idea that we're still pulling money out of a province like Alberta and putting it into provinces that, have in some ways higher standards of living, or at least they can deliver their services a lot cheaper. It just doesn't make sense. So I think there are a lot of really important questions here that do matter to the entire country. And I think, of course, it is that equalization question that makes us the most interested. Everyone around the country is tuning in to watch. And we know there won't be a direct impact. They're not voting to remove the equalization. They don't have that power. However, I think it will send such a big signal, and it will be such an important dialogue that we will begin having if Albertans choose to vote yes on that question and yes to eliminate equalization.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I will say, at the risk of thumping our own chest here, we've been covering Western alienation and the Western independence movement. And those two are not synonymous for reasons I'm sure we'll get into this evening. But we've been covering the Western alienation issue extensively. And I'd say we're probably one of the only, if not the only, non-Western media outlet that has been devoting that attention, because we realize, for all the reasons that you just mentioned, Candice, Alberta is very important in Confederation, and it's important to have this harmony across the country in the federal system. And the equalization referendum has always been held up by a lot of people as being that first step towards a more serious discussion of let's say we do this, we vote on this, and see how the federal government responds, and then we can sort of decide from there. But I wanted to ask you, William, as someone who's actually in Alberta, you live there, you've obviously had your finger on the pulse more directly than other people have here. Is the equalization referendum a symbol of something bigger, or do you think by and large people are voting based on that very specific question of should we seek to change the Constitution to get equalization out of there?
That's a really interesting question. I think when we see the results start to come in, I think it may give us some idea of what was in the forefront of Albertans' minds when they voted on equalization. For some, it is a rallying cry that says, we're tired of being taken for granted. We're tired of the federal government, particularly under Liberal prime ministers, ignoring the concerns of Albertans. We're sick of policies which seem targeted to harm our economy, thinking about pipeline bans, the forcing of a carbon tax onto Alberta when it explicitly rejected that idea. For others, they think it is a legal method that they can use, that the Supreme Court will have a duty to enforce negotiation. The federal government will have to negotiate in good faith. That being said, that's never been tested before. We're not 100% sure what happens when a non-cessation referendum question comes up for a vote. For others, though, it's a referendum more on Jason Kenney's leadership. And I think because this was his initiative, championed by him and his government, for people who are mad at Jason Kenney or who are disappointed in him, who think that the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic hasn't been as good as it should have been, some people may choose to vote no just because they don't like the premier. So it'll be interesting to see how the vote goes as we start to get those results in.
Well, and also we heard from Naheed Nenshi, the outgoing mayor of Calgary, sort of going on a little Twitter rampage saying to vote against the initiative, to vote no. William, do you think that will have an impact? I mean, to me, in my mind, it's like people liked Jason Kenney to begin with. The reason that Jason Kenney won in such a landslide was because he had this solid sort of fiscal conservative underpinnings, and he had that experience in the Harper government, and he sort of talked the talk. And so in my mind, people who even people who've been disappointed with the way that he's governed, they still have that underlying fiscal conservative mindset and worldview. And so it wouldn't so much be about Jason Kenney. It would more be about what's fair in Canada. And if Jason Kenney can't communicate that, then what better way to do it directly? That's my opinion. But what do you think about that?
Well, you're absolutely right that our soon-to-be former mayor did take a couple parting shots on his way out the door. Sometimes politicians, when they retire, do so gracefully, but that wasn't Nenshi's style. He basically used his last message to Calgarians to attack Jeremy Farkas, one of the leading mayoral candidates, and to tell people they should vote no on the equalization referendum to quote-unquote spite Jason Kenney. I don't actually think you should make policy decisions just to spite someone, but I guess maybe the argument could be made that we're doing this to spite Justin Trudeau. I'm not sure. That being said, I think for a lot of undecided voters who may have been on the fence about whether or not they should vote in the equalization referendum, I would vote against what Nenshi wanted because I'm kind of a conservative. So if Nenshi tells me to vote no, I'm going to vote yes. That was my approach.
And as mentioned there, Nenshi is up to be replaced tonight in the Calgary elections. We've got elections all over the province. And one interesting point I would raise here about the equalization referendum is that we might not know, well, we won't know the total results until I believe the 26th. What will we know tonight? Keeping in mind polls are going to be closing in, I think, 19 minutes, 18 and a half, 19 minutes as we come up to 8 p.m. Alberta time. But what's the issue with the count here for the referendum, William?
It's a little bit tricky. It actually took a few days to try and get an answer to that question. So while municipal elections are very clearly being run by municipal election authorities, the Senate elections and the province-wide referenda are both provincial issues. Elections Alberta has said they're not releasing official results until October 26th, but at least the municipality of Calgary has said they're going to release the unofficial results to both the Senate elections and the province-wide referenda tonight. Edmonton said they won't. Other jurisdictions across the province, we don't know. We're going to try and keep an eye on it to see how it goes. But I think as Calgary goes, it'll be a pretty good indication of where Alberta as a whole is going to head on those issues.
Yeah, there is a divide, though, is there not, between the cities and the rural parts of the province? Like, how much can you extrapolate from Calgary and Edmonton results?
So I'm sort of thinking if Edmonton is voting more one way and the rurals are voting more of another way, Calgary is sort of in the middle, halfway between big city, halfway between rural south. Its voting behavior tends to be in between Edmonton and southern constituencies when you look at provincial and federal elections. So I think if Calgary is moving clearly in one direction, that's going to be very helpful for us to know what the official results are going to be on October 26th. If it's very, very close, if it's 51-49, then it's anybody's guess what the outcome of those referendums will be a week later.
Candice, we're moments away from our first guest, but what are you going to be looking out for tonight?
Well, it's kind of too bad that the province couldn't get themselves organized enough to deliver results on what people are voting on. Not just because we're trying to do a live show here; it would make it a bit more interesting for us if we could walk away with that. But no, I think certainly the mayoral race in Calgary is really interesting. You know, we got a free market sort of small government guy in Jeremy Farkas who looked like he had a big lead at the beginning of the campaign. I know it's hard to keep track of polling in municipal elections because you really don't know until the polls come in. But I think certainly after, I guess we've had Nenshi for 10 years, William? It's definitely time for a change, I think. And I would welcome someone sort of young and ambitious and, committed to protecting the taxpayers like Jeremy Farkas.
Yeah, I know everyone tends to focus on the mayoral stuff, and I think for good reason. Obviously, the mayor, especially of a larger city, has the ability to really set the agenda. We saw Nenshi, for example, with trying to push an Olympic bid. One notable example that has probably traumatized William by just mentioning it. Sorry to bring you back there, William. But there's also, interestingly enough, in Calgary, a huge number of just general vacancies right now. Like, there's going to be a significant turnover on this council, isn't there?
You're absolutely right. In fact, I went back 30 years and couldn't find a municipal election with more open seats. Out of Calgary's 15 city council and mayor seats, 10 of them are open. And one of them, Ward 2, there is an incumbent running again, but he's currently the subject of an RCMP fraud investigation. So I think you can probably treat that seat as an open seat as well. So 10 or 11 open seats. It's an unprecedented number of open seats in a municipal election.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting, but I think that the thing that most people look at is the mayor. You know, that's the sort of bankable figure. And again, I think that Nenshi was really an outsized character for his role. I mean, he I don't think that many people in the country can name, the mayor of a smaller city. I mean, Calgary's a big city, but even so, I don't think most Canadians could name the mayor of Vancouver, the mayor of Montreal. But everyone knew Nenshi, and I think that was part because of the role that he played during the floods, and just being sort of an outspoken type for all the consternation that we hear about conservatives and Canadians being racist, sexist, bigoted, whatever. Here we have Nenshi, who comes from I believe he's Muslim, man, and there was no problem with that. There was no problem. Calgarians voted for him, and he was a very public mayor. So I think that it will be interesting, just to fill those big shoes, right, as such a public figure out in Edmonton. And then I don't know what's next for Nenshi. William, have you heard anything? Is he going to run federally? Is he going to run provincially? What do you think he's going to do next?
Yeah, there's lots of rumors that he's going to be a federal Liberal candidate, and that conversations have already had about him being a cabinet minister if he wins an election. Rumors that he might go to the United Nations, that he's always had a bit of a flair for international travel and affairs. I will say, having observed the mayor for quite a long time, I find it hard to believe he's going to go into party politics, because he doesn't particularly play well with others. He holds himself in very high regard, and to be a minister means to be kind of under the thumb of the prime minister. And I'm not sure he could ever be in that position where he didn't get to be the boss. So don't know what his next job will involve, but lots of rumors.
What about the mayor of Edmonton, the former mayor Iveson? Don Iveson? What do you think he's going to do next?
Yeah, he was first elected in 2013, so he's been there just about 8 years now. He's got a young family. I'm not sure what his plan is. Certainly, I would think he's leaving his office in slightly less anger than Mayor Nenshi is. I think there was a lot of people who were quite fed up with head Nenshi here in his final term. So I don't really know. He hasn't sort of mused about it, but I would think for any former mayor, there's going to be a lot of opportunity. I would say more opportunity than for a former MLA or MP, simply because mayors do have profile in their own cities.
This is True North's live election night show. We've got Candice Malcolm, William McBeth, and yours truly, Andrew Lawton. Candice, why don't we go to our first guest here?
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, we're very excited to have our friend, conservative strategist, Vitor Marciano on the line. Hi, Vitor. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's going to be an interesting evening.
All right. Well, let's unpack that a little bit. What do you find interesting? What's going to happen?
Well, you have literally Edmonton, Calgary, Red Deer, and Fort McMurray all getting new mayors on the same night. You've got, one province-wide referendum that's going to set the tone for a bunch of the politics that will happen in the next little while with the equalization referendum. You've got this other referendum that will actually kind of change everybody's life on a day-to-day basis, we think, if they actually implement it on the daylight savings case. And then you've got a whole bunch of council elections and other items sort of happening all across the province. So it's actually, a day that's going to change an awful lot of things. That makes it kind of interesting.
No, certainly. And that's why we're doing the show, right? Because we think that it's interesting, not just to Albertans, but to all Canadians. So, Peter, let's go through, what you said was interesting. Let's start with the mayoral races. So, can you give us some overview? Tell us what you think is going to happen in those big cities that you mentioned.
I can give you 3 of them. I have to admit that I have not paid as much attention to Red Deer as I should have, so I'm going to leave that one for someone else to comment on it. But yeah, in Edmonton, you've got a longtime mayor in Don Iveson who's retiring, and you're either going to get my prediction is that it'll either be Amarjeet Sohi or Mike Nichols. So you're either going to get a move a little bit to the right, maybe a move a little bit to the left.
Well, I want to stop you. I want to stop you right there, Vitor, because I was a little surprised to hear that Amarjeet Sohi was the front runner, because my understanding was that we remember him from his time as a cabinet minister in the Trudeau government, and my recollection was that he left office not being the most popular guy up in Edmonton.
I think that's completely fair. I think something very odd happened in the Edmonton election, and that is that the Edmonton media decided to completely ignore it. So I actually pointed this out on social media last weekend. You had the holiday long weekend just before an election. I went to the Edmonton Journal main page, the Edmonton Sun main page, and the CBC Edmonton main page, and none of them had anything about the mayoralty race. So you had a wide open mayoralty race and very, very few news stories about it. And the net effect of that is that it massively benefits the people with the highest level of name recognition. And then because Mike Nichols was in the race, it became a name recognition on the right versus a name recognition on the left. And my prediction is that tonight the left's going to win. This is Edmonton. It's a complicated mix. Mike's probably a little bit more conservative and a little bit more abrasive in his style than is traditional for Edmonton. And we're going to get that. It was a weird election in the sense that there were some newcomers to politics who brought up some interesting ideas, but they got no attention. There were past councillors who were in the race to win the election, Michael Oshry, Kim Krichel. They really didn't get any attention until the last week of the election. So it really became a Nickel Sohi drag race. And I really expect that that's what we'll see tonight. And the question is, has Mike Nickel assembled enough of a coalition, stolen enough voters from Oshry, Krichel, Cheryl Watson, who was the newcomer, to beat Amarjeet Sohi? Or has the fact that the left just didn't show up for this race other than in Amarjeet Sohi mean that he gets to consolidate all of the Liberal voters and all of the New Democratic voters and, strong support in the New Canadian community and take it to a win? So that's what I expect we will see come 8:45, 9 o'clock when we start to see the votes coming in. It'll be this drag race between Mike's right, center, right point of view and Amarjeet's left, center, left point of view. But I say that with some amount of caution because in many ways, Amarjeet didn't talk about the issues very much. He really ran a personality campaign. He really ran a name recognition campaign. An awful lot of his media availabilities or appearances at forums and that were kind of word salad-y rather than about anything specific. So he is in many ways campaigning on not being Mike Nickel, and which in some ways, kind of takes us back to what's happening in Calgary.
All right, well, let's jump to Calgary then. Walk us through what you think is going to happen down there.
Calgary had more media attention in the race than Edmonton. So, the Calgary Herald, the Calgary Sun both covered the race more carefully and more intensely. CBC Calgary spent money on doing polling, covered lots of the things in this race. Calgary, to be fair, has, I think it's 9 vacant council seats, whereas Edmonton only had 4 vacant council seats. But there was a deliberate effort to lift up the race. But in Calgary, it's also evolved into a sort of left, center, left race between Gondek and a right, center, right race with on the Farkas side. Bradfield, Jan Gomery, Bradfield and Davison were the 2 candidates that could have been sort of the centrist candidates in it. They never picked up the steam that would have been necessary to vault them into the race. Jan Damery, who's the clear left of center candidate in the race, also never picked up the steam that would have hurt Jody Gondek. So we're going to see a horse race today, I think, between Farkas and Gondek. It's going to be close.
Let me ask you
how the
about
media is
Calgary
painting it
detour
anyway.
from the perspective of your experience as a campaigner, because a lot of people, if they were to look at Calgary on a federal or provincial map, they'd see the sea of blue with a couple of specks of red. Yet on a municipal, you have had a left of center mayor for quite some time. You have a very real shot of electing another left of center mayor. How does that square? A city that's so solidly conservative in federal and provincial elections, but not at all municipally?
It actually squares, if you think about it from some of the truths and the truisms that conservatives talk about all the time, which is that people want more government from the level of government closest to the people. If you actually think about that concept of subsidiarity, people want services and expenses and things paid for and done at the city level. The problem is that when conservatives run municipally, they run as if they don't want anything to be spent or any money spent, and they're anti-building things. They oppose things at the municipal level. And the truth of the matter is that the vast majority of the citizenry says, well, if you're going to waste any money, waste it on my street. Waste it on the road that I use to commute. wasted on transit that I might access to commute or to go to a concert or to go to to a downtown arena. And so an awful lot of this is that folks in the conservative movement are a little bit more ideological than the voters. And the same voter who pretty comfortably votes conservative at the provincial level, very comfortably votes conservative at the federal level, wants a more activist government at the city level. If the city wastes some money, odds are I can see where they wasted it. It's not money that sort of disappears into the ether. It's usually spent on things where I can say, well, I wouldn't have built that, but we have it now. And an awful lot of conservatives who get involved in politics and even in municipal politics end up working really hard on their ability to say no. And the truth of the matter is, at the municipal level, the voters want people who are going to say yes, or your best case is probably a yes, but. And if Jeremy Farkas wins tonight, it'll be because in many ways the last month or two of his campaign have refocused and try to be more positive and more yes on things. And the word no, which would be the top word that folks would associate with Jeremy over the years, hasn't really been present in the campaign. If he doesn't win tonight, it might be because he wasn't sufficiently yes enough to captivate that next tranche or layer of voters who would swing in his direction, because they actually do want to see money spent on roads and transit and the sort of local services that they think makes a difference in their community. Oftentimes as conservatives, we just want to say no to big things at the national level, and then we want to say no to dumb things at the provincial level, and then we translate that into saying no to things at the municipal level. And there's a bunch of voters who are prepared to, accept those things. And I think, good municipal politicians need to learn, conservative municipal politicians need to learn to say yes, but, or to say, I really do care about building things that will make your life better. I'm going to try to do a better job of building them. I'm going to try to avoid waste. I'm going to try to, look at these important projects that need to be built with a hard, keen eye to making sure that they're done well. Too often, the top conservatives at city council, their specialty is saying no to things. And they're very proud of their record of voting no all the time. One of the lines I always use is in municipal politics, in Alberta at least, it's extremely rare for the leader of the opposition to be elected mayor. And if you're always the person saying no, it's hard to get the top job, because the voters usually want somebody who's going to say yes a fair amount. Both Edmonton and Calgary, we have the leaders of the opposition running today. They've both tried to do positive campaigns. If they succeed today, it's because they'll have convinced the voters that they're strike the right balance between being tight with money and delivering the sort of services that they want.
Well, that sort of reminds me of back in the day in Toronto with Rob Ford. He was the guy that was there to respect the taxpayers. He had a very simple message, but he was a subway guy. He said yes to subways. He was big on subways. Yeah, yep. Exactly. He was seen as someone who could get stuff done, but that at the end of the day, he was really there for the taxpayer, and he wanted to get rid of the waste, which sounds exactly like what you're prescribing there, Vitor.
And if just before you jump in, Vitor, I want to tell people polls are now closed. It is 8 p.m. So congratulations. You made it through a municipal and provincial election day. We'll have results with William Macbeth of True North in just a few moments, but I wanted to let you know we are on top of it. Polls have closed, and I'm sorry for that interjection, but it was a momentous occasion. Carry on, Vitor.
No problem. I'm going to say that in big parts of Calgary and in big parts of Edmonton, the polls are closed, and there's now a poll worker at the back of the lineup, which is probably halfway down the block. So people are going to be voting in a lot of places for another 40, 45 minutes. I live in a part of Edmonton that's got a high voter turnout. And when I went to vote at like 1:45, it still took me almost an hour to get through there.
It's that bad today.
There were that many people lined up outside. You get COVID, you get the 6-foot distancing, you get extra cleanup procedures inside the room. It takes longer to vote. It's a long ballot in Edmonton. It's a longer ballot in Calgary. I don't expect that we're going to get very many results coming in very quickly.
So when you say a long ballot, do you mean because there's so many different candidates, or because of all the different municipal councillors that are being reelected?
So both in Edmonton and Calgary, you get 2 ballots. So there's a municipal ballot and then the provincial ballot with the Senate election and the 2 referendums. In that provincial ballot is fairly long. There's I think 9 or 10 people running for the Senate race. You got to pick 3. And then you got the 2 referendums. But then when you go to the municipal ballots, you've got, in Calgary, you've got 20-some people running for mayor. Now, there's only 4 or 5 serious candidates, but we've never built a mechanism for weeding that out. So the list of people running is really quite long. Depending on your ward at the council level, you can have as many as 8 or 9 people running. Then you've got school board. And then Calgary on top of that has the non-binding recurring plebiscite on fluoridation. I'm an Edmontonian, so I get to laugh about this. The rest of the world has moved past the fluoridation debates of the 1970s. Calgary enjoys revisiting them at least once every 10 to 12 years. So.
Yeah, no, there's definitely some interesting ones out there. I want to talk to you, Vitor, though, about the equalization referendum, because really that's the big question of the night. That's the reason, part of the reason, probably the main reason why True North is covering this election, because we don't usually cover municipal elections, but because this question was on there, it's so consequential to everyone in the country, because we all, at its core, Canada it's a fiscal federation, right? We're here because we want to be able to trade with each other. We want to be able to have this stable system in our economy. And so, this question of equalization was in the Constitution in 1982. I wrote my Sun column the other day that this is the first time in my lifetime someone in Canada will have a say on equalization other than politicians. But I'm not even sure that in 1982 Canadians really had a say, or if it was something that was just put in there. So maybe you can walk us through the rationale, the thinking behind this question, and maybe the deeper question of whether we need equalization this day and age in Canada.
Well, I mean, that second question is a complicated one, and there's lots of Canadians who believe that equalization is really important. You could have questions on the principle of equalization. Ultimately, the point is separate entirely from the principle, is the fact that equalization, as it is done in Canada right now, is fundamentally unfair. And I lay that out to you by saying that from 2014 to just before COVID, Quebec ran 5 consecutive surpluses and set aside $20 billion while collecting between 11 and 13 billion a year in equalization money. So they are taking the equalization money and putting it in the bank, and they now have a rainy day fund that exceeds the Alberta Heritage Fund, which was put aside through oil and gas money, which is what ends up generating the extra money that the federal government has for equalization. Equalization is an unfair deal where it takes federal taxes from Alberta that never come back to Alberta and channels them to the poorer provinces and Quebec. And I say the poorer provinces and Quebec because the formula is written in such a way that Quebec will get money regardless. And at some point, something needs to be done about it. This equalization referendum is in some ways a symbolic vote, but it's a symbolic vote to kick open the door to have constitutional negotiations. And what will happen if the vote passes with a good number, and I'm hoping that it will, is that the Alberta legislature will then pass a motion of the legislature demanding constitutional negotiations premised upon the vote. That gets sent to the other provinces and to the federal government, who have a constitutional, conventional obligation to sit down and talk to Alberta about this question. The only people who have opposed the equalization referendum are political science professors. Other than Mayor Nenshi, everybody who said vote no are poli-sci professors. Rachel Notley has not gone on record saying vote no. She's tried to talk it down in some ways, but she won't actually say that Albertans should vote against it, because she knows that a no vote actually diminishes the negotiating position of any Alberta premier, of any political stripe for the long term. What's probably going to happen is that for a little bit, Albertans, I think tonight, are going to vote 58, 60%, maybe 62% in favor of the question, which is to remove equalization from the Constitution. That will start the process of constitutional negotiations. The federal government will, for a little while, try to ignore it. The big provinces will try to ignore it. But my prediction for you right now, I'm going to get this on the record. My old boss actually wrote a column about it this weekend, is that over the next 18 to 24 months, all of the small provinces in Confederation will say, COVID is bankrupting us. We can't afford healthcare. We can't afford the changes we need to make to seniors' care. Nobody wants to buy our debt. We don't have the ability to print money. The federal government's going to have to change the formula on how it transfers money for healthcare. And the net consequence of that is that all of the small provinces are going to view the opportunity to have constitutional discussions as a net positive. And they're going to, the Council of the Federation will be demanding these discussions in 18 to 24 months. And if Alberta gets a good number today, that is a good thing for Alberta. It makes sure that that when we discuss how the heck this country is going to be able to afford healthcare and improved seniors care in a post-COVID world, that at the same time we're discussing having an equalization system that has some level of fairness, where Alberta can't go through 5 years of brutal economic impact and still be paying into the rest of the country, while Quebec is having 5 years of tremendous economic growth and bringing in 11 to 13 billion extra dollars a year and setting aside essentially 4 billion a year of that into a little piggy bank of profit that they'll use to fund themselves through even more largesse and even more bad spending over time.
It's such an interesting way of framing it, Vitor. And you mentioned that the big provinces will probably ignore it. Interesting, because I've been talking to Bill Buick, who's one of the people who was sort of the spokespeople for the Yes campaign. And his mindset was that the people who are worse off under equalization are Alberta first, then British Columbia, then Ontario. And so, you have two of the other big provinces right there that are also bleeding through the nose. You had a great piece in the National Post, I think it was last week, Vitor, about how Canada's healthcare system is just, COVID is fundamentally broken. When you compare it to even the poorest of the U.S. states, their ICU capacity is leaps and bounds ahead of ours. And so it's hard for Canadians to wrap their head around the idea, because we're so used to having this concept that we have this great healthcare system that's, the envy of the world, and it's really showing that that's not true. And so, we are going to, at some point, we're going to be met with this issue of how are we going to pay for this? How are we going to continue on this path? And I thought you had a great way of sort of summing that up. So maybe just you can let the listeners know what it was that you wrote in the National Post and what you think the future of our healthcare system will be.
Well, I wrote the column because I'd seen a bunch of conservatives in Canada asking, why aren't we doing what Texas is doing? Why aren't we doing what Florida is doing? Why aren't we doing what a whole bunch of American states are doing, which is essentially pushing through the pandemic and saying that, recognizing that, man, COVID zero is not a potential solution for a country that's open and trading with the world, which Canada has to be. Frankly, we need our borders to be open, if only to bring in the number of immigrants we need to sustain our economic growth, because we don't have population replacement to do it ourselves. But the reason we couldn't do that is we cannot absorb the punch that comes from opening up society and going full on COVID. We do not have the hospital capacity in the richest provinces in Canada to get, well, in Alberta, we couldn't deal with 18 per 100,000 people sick at once. Now, there is no American state, not even the poorest state in the United States, that couldn't handle 30 or 40 per 100,000 sick at once. And when you can handle that many more people sick at once, when you've got that many more hospital beds, that many more doctors, that many more nurses, you can absorb the punch that COVID's going to give you. But when 18 people per 100,000, that's not 18 per 1,000, that's 18 per 100,000, is more than your hospital system can handle, you've got to do a whole series of policies designed around keeping COVID extremely low, which, by the way, means that you're going to have COVID for a much, much longer time. And it's going to become a significant impact on society and on your government finances for a longer and longer period of time. And then
very
when you put all
well
of that
said,
together,
Vitor Marciano, conservative strategist. Always a pleasure as we break down things that are happening in Alberta that are tied into much larger themes in Canadian politics. Vitor, thanks so much for coming on.
thank you for having me, Andrew. Thank you, Candice.
All right. Bye, Vitor.
You are tuned in to True North's live election night special for Alberta, municipal elections, Senate nominee elections, referenda galore at the provincial and municipal level. We've got lots planned for the remainder of the evening. We'll be joined later on by Danielle Smith. We'll break down the results we have coming in with William Macbeth very shortly. And if you've watched any of our previous election night shows, you know that we are here as long as it takes. We aren't going to be here live continuously until the 26th when results come in. We did plan for this, so we are going to wrap things up at some point tonight, although that's not something we can take for granted. As you may remember, our conservative leadership show infamously went, I think, like 8 hours to 3:30 in the morning or so. But we are doing these, and you know what? These are not inexpensive to produce. We've got a great team helping us behind the scenes that makes this happen, and more importantly, the coverage we do of these elections between these shows is not inexpensive. We have people on the ground where the stories are, and we don't get any of the government money. We don't get any of the bailout funds. We're not in that $600 million club that Justin Trudeau created for mainstream media journalists. We are supported by people who value the work we do. So if you're watching this show, if you're a regular viewer, listener, reader, or even if you just pop in from time to time, if you value the perspective and angle that we bring and the coverage plans that we put forward on all of these things, please do support the work we're doing financially if you can by going to donate.tnc.news. As I said, I mean, this is something that for us is a passion, but we've got people to pay. It costs money to do this. And literally, we're only able to do this because of the people that value the work that we are doing. So I wanted to, if you are watching, put that plug in. Candice, you know, the donors we have are always so supportive of the work. And I notice a lot of them are from Alberta too.
Absolutely. I think that it really, the heart and soul of the conservative movement in Canada exists in Alberta. Even even though it must be disheartening for people in Alberta, vote conservative, and you don't see a government that reflects you in any way out in Ottawa. The machinery behind the political party, behind the Conservative Party, exists in Alberta. That's where the donors are. That's where the political sort of everyone goes and spends time in Alberta in the Conservative movement. Andrew, you go out there and speak all the time, and it's just because connecting with people in Alberta, you really understand the way of life that they have out there, the way that sort of freedom and family come first. And I wish that the rest of the country thought a little bit more like Alberta, and that the values of Alberta had more of an influence on central Canada instead of vice versa, or in addition to vice versa, I should say. But really, we are all very interested in what's going on in Alberta. It deeply impacts the rest of the country, and I think it's just been a great opportunity for us to cover this election tonight and to find out what's going to happen, especially with the referendum on equalization. Like Vitor was just really hitting the nail on the head when he was talking about the whole reworking of our system post COVID, because everybody's been struggling. Everyone's healthcare system is at capacity. Every province. So some Canadians might be smug looking at Alberta and saying, "Oh, look at the way that they're handling this fourth wave." And after they loosened restrictions over the summer, they're really getting hit hard. But the reality is that we can see the writing on the wall. It's going to happen across the country. As soon as the weather gets colder, we're going to get that fourth wave is going to hit harder. And everyone talks about how the Delta variant is more contagious than the previous waves. I mean, it's going to be a big issue for everyone in Canada. So no one should be smug looking at another province when it comes to their capacity. But anyway, we think it's an important issue. It's just why we're covering it here on True North. And also, I should mention that the way that we're streaming this show tonight, I'm actually able to see all of the comments on both Facebook and YouTube, which is really cool, because usually when you're doing a live show, you've got a lot of things going on your screen in front of you, but it's very cool. So I can actually, when people are commenting, we're reading it, we're seeing it. So keep us posted. Let us know what you think of the show. Let us know if there's anything you think we should be talking about. I'm interested in people in Alberta. Tell us what you think about the provincial government and Jason Kenney. It's sort of the elephant in the room. We haven't discussed it at all yet, Andrew, but Jason Kenney is the most unpopular premier in Canada. and he's had a tremendous fall from grace just in terms of his support. He can't really seem to please anybody at this point, and seeing his popularity plummet has been disheartening as a conservative, but also sort of a cautionary tale of what happens when you sort of abandon some of your core principles, and looking at the way that Alberta has sort of particularly treated Christian pastors who have carried on with their services despite really heavy-handed COVID restrictions and restrictions that don't apply evenly. Like, you have situations where you can go to a football game, but you can't go to church. I mean, it's pretty ridiculous. And to see a conservative government, being the one that's running it is just been incredibly sad and unfortunate, I think. So, some of us have mentioned that, Kenny's unpopularity may in fact hurt this equalization referendum. Vitor, who's much more connected on these things than I am, seemed pretty confident that the equalization vote would go yes, which a yes vote, that the wording of the question is something like, should equalization be removed from the Constitution? So you're voting yes if you are against equalization, which is a little confusing if you don't read the question carefully. But anyway, that's certainly something that we'll be watching closely.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, I don't knock Vitor's knowledge and wisdom on this, and I generally don't make predictions so that I can't be wrong. It's actually a great plan. You should try it, everyone tuning in. But I will say, if the referendum doesn't succeed or is very, very close, I do think that those things you just talked about, Candice, Jason Kenney's unpopularity will have been a huge, huge contributing factor for a couple of reasons. I think a lot of people view this as Kenney's pet project, and in some ways that's fair because this was a campaign promise. It's something that he has personally championed. At the same time, it also is something that he hasn't been able to promote. Because for the longest time, I was watching, knowing this was coming and sort of waiting for the campaigns to get going. And there have been a couple. You've had Kevin Lacey of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation with his Fight Equalization campaign, Bill Buick, who's going to be on the show later on, and Fairness Alberta has had their Fight Equalization campaign. Certainly, you've had a lot of discussions and interviews and op-eds and all of that. But Jason Kenney really hasn't been selling this. He hasn't been out there talking day in, day out about why Albertans should vote yes. Some MLAs have spoken out about it, but there really hasn't been, I'd say, a lot of attention given to it. And even if you look at some of the money that the campaigns are spending, we're not talking about huge province-wide campaigns here that are spending millions and millions of dollars. Like, it's not like it's as hyped as the Quebec secession referendums, just to give it, or referenda rather, just to give a comparison to a very large and much vaunted one. So that isn't to say it won't succeed, but because of all these challenges in Alberta, and I think because Jason Kenney has been having to play defense, there hasn't really been a vocal standard bearer and flag bearer for this movement.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that was probably very intentional on behalf of Jason Kenney. He knows that he's not popular and that he doesn't want to put his name all over this twofold, right? He doesn't want to bring down the referendum just because of his own personal unpopularity, but he also doesn't want to hitch himself to it. If it gets defeated, then it looks even worse for him. But yeah, I mean, it's been pretty low profile given how much was sort of drummed up at the beginning. And also remember, Andrew, this was sort of Jason Kenney's alternative to the big, loud Wexit movement that came out of the 2019 election. I know you covered that. You were out in Alberta several times. And, after that election, it was like this huge groundswell of sort of anger and frustration and this very, very public movement. Wexit, I think it morphed into the Maverick Party and its profile sort of fell. But the idea was that there was a lot of Albertans out there that were angry, that wanted out, including some pretty high profile, business people and people in the business community. And so the referenda was sort of like an alternative as a way to keep Albertans sort of focused on the Canadian picture and keeping them focused on, okay, we can still negotiate a better deal within Canada as opposed to this other movement that was really pushing in a different direction. So I think that kind of anger, that big burst, that moment has passed, and now we're sort of in this period where no one, like you said, no one's really heavily campaigning for it, other than the sort of activist people that really understand the issue and that are pushing for it, like Bill Buick, who we'll have later on the show.
It is at 8:21 Alberta time. Want to bring back into this True North's own William Macbeth. I know polls have only been closed for about 21 minutes or so, and as Vitor was saying, in some of the bigger cities, a lot of lines, so people may still be voting even past the official closure. Any early results here, William?
This will be a really quick analysis because there have been no posted results. So far, we don't.
So it's a tie. It's neck and neck, you'd say.
It is the closest election I can recall.
We were just talking before you came on about what seems like, and again, this may be my Easterner perspective shining through, but it seems like a lack of oxygen to the equalization referendum outside of the circles that really pay close attention to this. Has that been your experience in Calgary, in Alberta, that this hasn't been like one of these campaigns that you can't walk down a street without seeing a sign for?
No, I absolutely think you're right. It has been very, very low key. There's a few things that I think contribute to that. Up until, sort of mid-September, we were having a federal election. And I think for a lot of people, this municipal campaign didn't even really get onto people's radar until after that federal election wrapped. So they really only had about 4 weeks to get up and out. But, I was active on the No Olympics plebiscite vote, and I felt that had far more oxygen going into it than this equalization referendum has. I think Vitor made a lot of really important points about why Albertans appear to be voting very conservative federally and provincially, but that we aren't seeing that reflected in mayoral campaigns. I think one point he made, which is important, is we don't have municipal political parties, of course. Anybody who wants to run basically can. Calgary has 27 people running for mayor right now. So, how to stand out in a crowd of 27 people is really difficult, which is why if you look in both Edmonton and Calgary, the only people who are really getting any oxygen in that mayoral race are current or former city councilors who already have name recognition, who already have political infrastructure, and who already have a base of support from which they can build on. The second thing I think that's interesting is, and we should talk a little bit about, is the role of third-party groups or political action committees or PACs. Edmonton didn't see as many PACs as Calgary did. Calgary saw a large number. But the PAC that's being run by Alberta's public sector unions is spending upwards of $2 million to elect their preferred candidates in this race. And given that unions and corporations are prohibited from giving money to local campaigns, that could well be more than what all of the mayoral candidates are spending combined in this election. So, I'll be interested to see exactly how much money they spent when the disclosure reports come out. But there's going to be I think a lot of money spent by public sector unions to vote for non-fiscal responsibility candidates.
It's interesting that they find a way to sneak money into that. What about the federal MPs or some of the more high-profile politicians in Alberta, people like Michelle Rempel? Have they gotten involved in the referendum debate at all, or the discussion, or they kind of stayed out of it?
I mean, a few of them have used their own networks to promote the referendum and the equalization cause. Michelle Rempel, a prominent MP from Northern Calgary, has posted a few videos and some other social media content about why it's important to vote yes on equalization. Stephanie Kuzy from the Southeast has also posted on that issue. But overall, not very much. You aren't seeing a lot of activity from either provincial or federal representatives. I mean, I guess the federal representatives, maybe you can explain it's just not their area, but you would think that since it's a province-initiated referenda, that UCP MLAs would be campaigning door to door even to try and get yes votes out for it. I think, though, that, again, the recent poll I saw had the UCP down below 30% in popular support. They may have decided that this was the wrong time to wrap this referendum around the UCP government.
Let's unpack that a little, William. You know, you're a conservative and you're in Alberta. What is happening? What is driving the UCP's plummet in support? Why do people in the province feel so disappointed, dismayed with Jason Kenney right now?
Well, I can't speak for every single conservative, nor would I try. But I do think there are two groups of people in Alberta who are unhappy with Premier Kenney's leadership. The first would be those who felt he did not do enough, that restrictions came too late, that the Open for Summer campaign was a mistake, that we declared victory over COVID when, in fact, we were not anywhere close to being ready for that. But that being said, I think a bigger problem is probably the people who felt that Alberta's approach to COVID management was too heavy-handed. And the campaign it waged against religious institutions in particular, churches and Christian churches in particular, because those are the ones we saw legal action being taken, pastors being arrested, police coming into holy services while they're being performed by religious personnel. The arbitrariness of some rules, why public gatherings of some types were banned when others were allowed. A lot of this played very poorly with conservatives who are always a little bit skeptical of big government anything. We don't tend to think government is great at doing most things. And the bigger the task, the worse we think government tends to do at it. So I think there was a lot of people who thought Jason Kenney should have taken a much different approach to how COVID went. And in the same way that they were disappointed maybe more wasn't done about Western alienation and Alberta's grievances against the federal government, they also believe that he seemed to be showing too much aggression in the enforcement of COVID rules in Alberta.
Well, yeah, that's certainly what I saw, and I mean, it's one of those things that the whole country has had that, and we talked about it a little bit with Vitor, how a lot of conservatives are saying, where's the Ron DeSantis of Canada? Why can't one of the provinces like Alberta, go the route of Texas or Florida and just say, screw you to all the people who are, stressing unlimited forever restrictions, COVID zero, all that nonsense, and just say, let's live our lives, let's get to herd immunity, let's just live. And they wanted a conservative to do that. We didn't see that with Doug Ford in Ontario. We certainly didn't see it with Jason Kenney in Alberta. The closest we got was that Best Summer Ever campaign, but then it seemed like they cowered on it right away. And to Vitor's point, it's because we don't have the hospital capacity. It's like, when you have a free society and you have a free country like they do in Texas and Florida, and you have private competitive hospitals, there's much more room for people to go. And unfortunately, the reality in Canada is that we have this very rigid government-run healthcare system that just doesn't, we just don't have the capacity to have people who need care in. So I can see how you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. But boy, Jason Kenney's numbers are really looking bad.
Well, I think, post this referendum, depending on what the outcome is, and if the outcome if it passes, maybe that's going to be helpful to Premier Kenney. He'll be able to claim a victory. He'll claim a mandate to be able to negotiate with Ottawa for a better deal. Certainly, I think Alberta premiers can find a boost in popularity by picking a big fight with a Liberal Prime Minister in Ottawa. It is a time-tested strategy to boost popularity if you can find a big fight. And so that might be something. But if he loses this equalization referendum, he's already facing the prospect of a leadership review in just a few months from now in spring 2022. And this may be another factor that weighs on delegates and voters' minds when they go to decide if they want to keep him as leader or if they want to replace him before the next election.
Yeah, I mean, especially if it looks like he was not selling this referendum. I mean, if people start to put a defeat at his feet, pardon the other redundancy there, the perceived redundancy, I can imagine that won't reflect too well on him. We will get back to breakdown results from you, William, later on in the show. Go find some ballots, though. Go find some ballots next time you come back, okay?
I'll go get my shoes and go see if I can find some on the streets.
All right, you can count these things quite easily. Candice, who do we have next?
All right. Well, we're really excited to be welcomed by our friend Sheila Gunn-Reid, who is the Alberta Bureau Chief for Rebel News. And Sheila, thank you so much for joining us on our show tonight. What does your shirt say? I can't see it.
Oh, my shirt says Glenn Carrot for mayor, a leader who listens. Now, Glenn Carrot is a friend of mine. He's running for mayor of Innisfail, Alberta. He's a high-profile Fight the Fines client there. He had the cops called on him by, it sounds like another campaign, when he had the Easter Bunny at a campaign event earlier in the spring, and he ended up in the Rebel News Fight the Fines ecosystem, but he's run completely on an anti-lockdown, anti-vaccine passport mandate, and he was the organizer of United We Roll. So while I generally don't like politicians and I tend not to endorse them, except for Andrew, you're a recovering politician, Glenn is a good friend, and he's one of the only candidates out there running on an anti-lockdown platform. So I am Team Carrot.
Great.
I will just say, for the sanity of our managing director, William, God love him, we are, as an organization, nonpartisan. We don't endorse any candidates. So Sheila has done this all on her own, but I do appreciate, obviously, the opportunity to cover these people, which is our focus as a news organization.
No, I don't want to put my endorsement of Glenn Carrot on True North at all.
No one can suck the oxygen out of a discussion like I can with a disclaimer. So take it away, Candice.
Well, you're going to have to keep us updated on, the results as they come in, Sheila. If you have to jump in and say breaking news, this guy's won, you can go ahead and do that. So Sheila, we were just talking a little bit about Jason Kenney and his sort of big, massive unpopularity in Alberta, which, for a guy that got elected, I think with 62% of the vote not too long ago, maybe 2 years ago, to see him sinking down, I should say, to 30% or less approval, the lowest out of all the premiers. And for us who aren't in Alberta, we're trying to sort of wrap our heads around that and try to think about how that might impact this referendum on equalization. So, you've got your finger on the pulse of the province, and we know that obviously your Fight the Fines campaign is really onto something. Same with your amazing coverage of some of these Christian pastors who have had their services stormed by police officers. It's like you're watching a different country. It's so mind-boggling, especially for in a province run by a person who used to be one of the foremost champions of religious freedom in the country. And I'm sure he still holds those values in Jason Kenney, but really it's hard to watch some of the things that have happened in Alberta. So maybe you can just help us understand what's going on in that regard.
Sure. I mean, when you look at the polling data, it doesn't look like a lot of those votes are swinging back to Rachel Notley. About 10-15% maybe, depending on the polling that you look at. A lot of it is just evacuating the Jason Kenney camp, and it's going to other places. It's going to, I'm never voting again. It's sort of heading into that territory, but it's also going into some of the breakaway parties, the sort of separatist parties, Wild Rose, some of those other fractured parties. And I think that's one of the things about Albertans that sort of makes us unique in the political landscape is that we will burn it all down every few years or, sometimes 4 decades with the PCs of old, but we will burn it all down when we don't think our conservative candidates and our conservative governments and our conservative politicians, when we don't think they're conservative enough and behaving like conservatives. We're not scared to do that. And unfortunately, that's what's happening to Jason Kenney right now. While, conservative politicians think they are owed our votes by nature of being conservative, for the voter, we really do make them earn it. And we can't see Jason Kenney in 2021. We don't see the same guy that was elected back in 2018 or that sort of reached across the aisle and united the Wild Rose to the PCs after so much bad blood and so much contention between those two parties. He was able to be, for lack of a better term, politically ecumenical and unite those two parties. We're not seeing any of that right now. We're seeing someone who doesn't reflect his own conservative past with regard to the Office of Religious Freedom and his defense of religious liberty around the world. We're not seeing someone who is politically ecumenical with other conservatives. We've seen Jason Kenney say, If that's my base, I need a new base, referring to the anti-lockdown movement. So, I think, with some of the results tonight, I know Calgary is a very conservative place, and Jeremy Farkas, I mean, he was polling slightly ahead of his more left-leaning competition there. But in Edmonton, it's a complete and total collapse so far of the ability of Conservatives to get the vote out. And I think that has a lot to do with Jason Kenney.
Interesting. We were talking a bit before. You said that the 2018 Jason Kenney is not the same guy that's leading the province now. I think back then there was sort of this hope that Alberta was going through a really rough economic time with the price of oil falling, and with Justin Trudeau in office, killing all the pipelines, and the idea was like, okay, here's this guy who was in the Harper government, and he has a long history of really proving his conservatism, and he's sort of an outsider in regards to the provincial politics of Alberta. He wasn't like in the sort of, like you mentioned, the bad blood between the PCs and the Wild Rose. And so he sort of came in and really had expectations that were so high that no one could meet. And so many things are just sort of outside of his control. And so this referendum question, to bring it back to that, the idea was that there was so much anger after the 2019 election, that the whole Wexit movement, I know you covered that really closely, Sheila, this idea that Alberta was going to separate. I noticed some people in the comments are still saying Alberta should join the US, be the 51st state, Alberta secession, Alberta should go it alone. And we did hear that a lot in 2019. I don't hear it as much. I still hear it occasionally. But the referendum question was sort of an alternative to that sort of angrier, let's go it alone question. And so do you think that this referendum really does capture the mood to say, like, let's keep Canada, let's keep Alberta in Confederation, let's keep this thing going, but let's try to negotiate a better deal? Or is there still a lot of anger and this sort of like separatist crowd out there?
That's a really good question, and it's a very complex question, because I do believe that the separatist sentiment is still as high as it ever was. Although the 2 years out from that last election, there hasn't been a that has emerged from that movement. There's sort of these little fractured parties, and they're having a hard time getting together. And there's no one person that has that sort of Ralph Klein mindset of, somebody once asked Ralph Klein what was his key to political success. And he said, the ability to see where the parade is marching and then just get out in front of it and lead it. There's no one person that's really identified themselves as someone who can sort of take that juggernaut of separatist sentiment and take it somewhere, because, there, as you rightly point out, there are different ideas of what separatism means. Is it just a reflex against the unfairness of equality? Is it a rejig of our role in Confederation, that we become more sovereign in the sense that Quebec is? Does it mean withdrawing from Confederation altogether? Does it mean joining the United States? There's nobody that has really articulated what or where the separatist movement in the West should be going. And furthermore, the fact that Quebec has already gone through this, there's a lot of resources out there that Westerners can just reach into Quebec and grab the expertise and say, what did you do to deal with this issue? How did you figure out this issue? How did you address that, criticism of what you were trying to do? Nobody's really done that in Alberta, and I don't really understand why. And I think Jason Kenney's referendum question is sort of appeasing some of those separatist sentiments. And frankly, as an Albertan who pays pretty close attention to these things, it's kind of my job, I haven't really seen any passion about this referendum question. The Conservatives weren't out there selling it. They weren't campaigning on it. It was like nobody cared. Maybe it got lost in the pandemic, or maybe it was just lip service to the anger of Westerners. I can't really tell, because there wasn't a lot of discussion about it at all outside of like really keen political watchers like we are.
Yeah, you raise an important point there, Sheila, and we were talking about that a little bit earlier, and all of us sort of wondered if actually it would make matters worse for those wanting a yes vote on equalization if Jason Kenney and the UCP were behind it, given their fortunes right now. But I also think at the same time, when you look at the Fair Deal panel, which was criticized, I mean, notably by one of the members of the Fair Deal panel, Drew Barnes, who's now been ousted from the UCP caucus for criticizing Jason Kenney, there were a lot of recommendations in there. Obviously, some people thought it didn't go far enough. Equalization is just one of many grievances that the Western alienation mindset people and Western independence mindset people and outright Western separatists have. It's one issue. And one of the challenges here is that I feel it has served as a very convenient excuse to not do anything else, because it allows the UCP to say, all right, well, let's just see how this referendum goes. There are a lot of things that could be done right now unilaterally by the province, such as securing an Alberta police force, moving on an Alberta pension, moving to collect income tax in Alberta like Quebec does, downloading a couple of federal provincial programs to become predominantly provincial in responsibility. There are a lot of things in that list, and that was just, one off the top of my head that Alberta could do without a referendum, that Alberta could do without any federal buy-in or constitutional change. But I feel by putting all the eggs in the referendum basket, you kind of just are able to take everything else off the table for now politically.
Yeah, it feels like they're sort of shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic a little bit. I mean, we did earlier this year get our own chief firearms officer. So that was one of the recommendations that came out of the Fair Deal panel. And then this. But the chief firearms officer is really just a sort of symbolic thing. It doesn't really change the gun laws that are being drafted by the federal government. And
she just might feel bad when she's taking your guns that Trudeau has banned.
Yeah. Poor lady, Justin Trudeau made her do these things to us, but it really doesn't change, the aspect of the federal law surrounding that. So, I mean, it was a symbolic gesture that we're going to have our own person, I guess, confiscate our guns. But yeah, I'm with you on this, where it does feel like I said earlier, just sort of paying lip service to, oh, look at us, we're standing up to Justin Trudeau. But this comes after 3 years of strongly worded letters and not much else.
And we were talking about this a little earlier. I mean, you mentioned that there wasn't really a lot of steam. Like, we didn't hear much from federal MPs. Like, I was sort of, I know Michelle Rumpel has been pretty vocal, and she had her whole Buffalo declaration that was outlining as well, sort of different things that Alberta could do. And I haven't heard anything from her on this. We didn't hear much from Jason Kenney. And so it's almost like, I mean, I don't even know what to expect. We had Vitor Marciano on earlier, and he predicted that the people would vote yes somewhere around 55 to 60%, which that would be a pretty strong message. But I don't even know where that prediction would come from. I don't know if there's been polling out there. But what do you think is going to happen tonight, Sheila?
Well, I think it will be around 55 to 65%. I'm only loosely basing that on my own estimation of just how many people are going to vote in favor of the referendum question in Calgary and then in the rural municipalities. It's sort of the same thing. To become the premier of Alberta, you have to win Edmonton or Calgary and all the rural areas. I think that's sort of what's going to happen with the referendum question. Of course, Edmonton being the seat of government, and again, referring to Ralph Klein, a place with too many socialists and mosquitoes, as he once said, that's going to be, a lost cause when it comes to the referendum question. And Amarjeet Sohi is likely to become the mayor there. A proponent of Justin Trudeau's carbon tax, gun grab, and all those bad things that Justin Trudeau has done to Alberta in the last 6 years. That's Edmonton's going to vote for that. I don't know. If you want to talk a place that's culturally incompatible with the rest of Alberta, it's Edmonton.
It's Edmonton. Well, I lived there for 4 years, and it's funny. Most of my friends up there are pretty conservative, but it's probably just because you tend to attract like-minded people when you're up there. But I will say the University of Alberta was a pretty hostile place to conservatives, which for me, I grew up in Vancouver, and I thought, okay, I'm going to go to University of Alberta. It's going to be super conservative, right? Because you just think Alberta's a conservative place, University of Alberta is going to be conservative. And boy, was I wrong. There was a lot of
emphasis on the university, not the Alberta.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I didn't know that, but I learned. Well, in some ways, it's kind of a sad state of affairs, Sheila. You said that there's no real leader leading the charge on sort of putting Alberta first, or if there were any kind of a secession or just more independence movement, there isn't really a leader of that, even though there are some very articulate, interesting people that are proponents of it. I'm thinking of people like Barry Cooper, who's a professor down at the University of Calgary, and many others. But I feel like the state of conservative politics more broadly is that way. You have a federal party led by Aaron O'Toole, who once told us that he was a true blue conservative. He was the real deal. And then in the campaign, what we saw was, Justin Trudeau with a blue tie on. And at the provincial level, you have a lot of people who are super disappointed in Jason Kenney, super disappointed in Doug Ford out in Ontario. And you kind of look around the country and you wonder where are all the strong conservative voices? Where are sort of the next generation of leaders in this movement? And it's sort of slim pickings right now. I mean, maybe someone like Jeremy Farkas down in Calgary might be a bright light in the province and in the conservative movement more broadly, but why do you think the Conservatives have become so bad at producing really interesting, impressive leaders? And why don't we have more people filling the void and sort of being that next generation of leaders in this country?
Yeah, it's very strange that Canadian Conservatives, like the official Conservatives, they have a real tough time doing the whole youth recruitment thing. As much as they'd like to have the youth wing of the party, they don't do a really good job of it. And they're not doing a really great job of learning about what happened in the United States. The boldest conservatives there are the most popular. And in Canada, the boldest conservatives end up sort of experiencing tall poppy syndrome, where the other conservatives come along and chop them down. And,
they all get ousted from the parties.
Yeah, the boldest conservatives are the strongest independents.
Yeah, they go off into the wilderness, and then no one wants anything to do with them anymore because they're splitting the right. And it's like,
yeah, well, and it's for me as a conservative, I think one of our best qualities, but one of the things that makes us least electable is the fact that we are independent. We have interesting ideas, and we don't always go along to get along, and we aren't always just interested in winning at all costs, which is it's great because it fosters this diversity of ideas, but at the same time, it makes us tough to be elected because, there are conservatives who just won't vote for the sake of gaining power. But with regard to young conservatives, we really don't do a good job at harvesting, I think, the young angst of conservatives. I have a son, he's, in his early 20s. And, when we're talking, when he was a little bit younger, I would say, that feeling where you don't like being told what to do all the time, and you don't like me telling you what to say and how to behave. I'm like, that's how I feel every single day as a conservative. That's how I feel about the government. And we do a poor job at telling young people that, it's okay to be conservative. It's okay to not want to be told how to talk and to, say things. And young people by nature are really not politically correct. That's, it's one of the great things that my son has going for him, but it's really irritating as a parent. But, like the second we have a young conservative learning how to be conservative and they say something that's not exactly PC, we just throw them out of the party. And, these are our best and brightest and our leaders of tomorrow. And we're just sort of throwing them out, like literally throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think it's a terrible idea. And it's one thing they do much, much better than us in the United States.
Rebel News Alberta Bureau Chief Sheila Gunn-Reid joining us live. Sheila, always a pleasure. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
You are tuned in to True North's live Alberta election night show. I understand we do have some results coming in, so we will get those broken down and go to our correspondent, William Macbeth, very shortly. But first, I want to bring into this discussion Danielle Smith, who is the president of the Alberta Enterprise Group and no stranger to running for office in Alberta and actually holding office in Alberta. Danielle, welcome. Great to talk to you again. Oh, we are still waiting for Danielle. Sorry about that. We'll get her on in just a moment as we have some tech issues. Maybe we will go to William in the interim here. William, what results are we seeing so far?
So we are getting some results from both Edmonton and Calgary. In Edmonton, as was kind of expected, Amarjeet Sohi is leading by about 8%, 38-30 over Conservative Mike Nickel. But that's a very early result. Only about 8 polls are reporting so far out of about 200. So I don't think we can call that one yet. But in Calgary, it is starting to look like we're going to be close to being able to call the mayoral race for Jyoti Gondek. She is a one-term councillor. She's presently leading with 45% of the vote and about half of the polling stations, a little over half the polling stations reporting. Next closest is Jeremy Farkas, who's at 29%. And so given that it's a gap of 16%, with more than half of the polling stations reporting, I think we're getting pretty close to being able to say that Jyoti Gondek will be the next mayor of Calgary. And then in terms of the equalization vote, not as we talked about earlier, not every jurisdiction is reporting those results tonight, but we are getting results from Calgary so far. About 57% so far are voting yes on the equalization referendum. That's pretty close to what Sheila guessed would be the case. 43% voting no so far. And in the Senate race, we're seeing the 3 candidates endorsed by the Conservative Party of Canada far out in front of any of the other candidates in the election. So, and that's with about 161 polls reporting in Calgary so far.
Great. Thank you very much for that update, William. We'll check back in with you very shortly. I understand now we have Danielle Smith standing by. And just so she doesn't get shortchanged on the introduction, she is the president of the Alberta Enterprise Group. Danielle, always a pleasure. Thanks for coming on.
Nice to see you.
One of the things, as we just hear these results, that Jyoti Gondek, it sounds like, is on track to be the winner of the Calgary mayoral race. We're not calling it officially, but she's very much in the lead with a pretty significant number of the polls in. Similarly, in Edmonton, not as many polls in yet, but Amarjeet Sohi in the lead there. You wrote a great analysis. It was, I think, very sobering for people on the right in your newsletter on this yesterday. And you said that there really isn't much in the way of infrastructure for people on the right in municipal politics. And I think we're seeing this now in the most conservative province in Canada, very poor showings in the biggest cities in that province.
We've got 2 problems, I think. Well, maybe more than 2, but 2 that I have off the top of my head. One of them is that we always split the vote among Conservatives. And so in both Edmonton and in Calgary, we ended up with 3 or 4 sort of conservative or center-right candidates, and then 1 identifiably progressive or leftist candidate. And as a result, the unions, who had strong PAC support in Calgary, Political Action Committee support in Calgary, and a little bit up in Edmonton as well, they're able to provide the funding for 1 candidate, which allows them to get their signs and get their message out and get volunteers and get lit drops. Whereas the Conservatives, the ones that I spoke with, had a really difficult time raising any sort of funding. That's the other part of the problem, is that we love to have this puritanical idea that there should be no big money in politics. And so at the federal and provincial level, we got rid of union and corporate donations. And so they decided to do the same thing at the municipal level. Problem is, there's no tax receipt to give a contribution to a municipal candidate. And there's no rebates like there is at the federal level. And so if you're a brand new candidate right out of the gate, you're trying to get money from friends and neighbors, and you're competing with all the other things that they could be giving money to. So we've really starved out our municipal level of office of money, of organizers. There seems to be a real lack of interest among Conservatives about municipal office. And I don't understand why that is, because the left has understood that you can use municipal office as training ground for your candidates for provincial and federal office. And we don't do that in municipal politics, and we should. Maybe this is unique to Alberta. Maybe you have a more interest, particularly in Toronto, where it's a much bigger representation base. But I would say, generally speaking, we don't do a very good job of cultivating the local level of office and local candidates.
No, and we were talking about this earlier in the show with Vitor Marciano. He said, there's a conservative instinct to say we don't want the federal government to spend anything. We don't want the provincial government to spend anything. And I mean, unless you want no governments to spend anything, which I think is an entirely defensible position and probably the one I'd take on a lot of issues. Conservatives, generally speaking, are on board with local government, direct democracy. I mean, the best thing you can do if you're a diehard conservative activist is get involved on a school board, get involved at the local level in politics, but it becomes very difficult to actually transition that into a movement and to do it in the way that the left does it.
It's very true. And I think part of it is that you do have this union dominance that happens at the municipal level. For some reason, we always get higher turnout at the federal level for elections, and then followed by the provincial level, and then municipal. And so if you happen to work for the city, that you're somebody who works in transit, or you work as a city worker in permitting or in tax collection, or any of the other services cities provide, then you have police, fire, you've got a vested interest in trying to see who gets elected on council. And so those groups do tend to organize and get their members organized, and then they get their friends and family organized. And as a result, you do end up with a complexion, even in Calgary and Edmonton, which should be the most business-minded and entrepreneurial cities in the country. Since we're the most conservative province in the country, you would expect that our two major cities would represent that. They've got 2/3 of the population after all, but it doesn't seem to be turning out that way. So this is a real problem. The other issue, though, is that COVID derailed everything for conservatives over the last year and a half, because conservatives really couldn't find a position that was consistent with what the majority of their membership base wanted, because that's so offside with what the general public wanted. And I think in Calgary in particular, it's become a bit of a referendum on who do you trust to get you through the fourth wave and the fifth wave and whatever other future waves there would be. And the candidate that's in the lead right now, Jody Gondek, is the one who took the strongest and most strident and most challenging position to the provincial government right from the get-go. And it could well be that became the ballot question, and the other candidates weren't able to catch up. I mean, it's still early days in the counting, and it could change, but that's a pretty big lead to try to overcome.
Let's turn to the referendum here. Now, this is something that for, political diehards like us who want, results tonight, and we would have stayed up till 5 a.m. for them, we won't get that privilege because for the most part, they aren't going to be reported officially until the 26th. So all we have to go on are the municipalities that are reporting them tonight. And I think Calgary is probably one of the only ones. But it sounds like, again, even though it's a bit early, the Calgarians are favoring the equalization vote. Do you think we can extrapolate from that beyond Calgary?
It'll be interesting to see what happens in Edmonton, because with the Calgary and Edmonton will make up 2/3 of the vote. Calgary had 57%, I think was the last time I looked, in favor of taking equalization out of the Constitution, 43% opposed. If you end up with roughly similar numbers in Edmonton, and I can guarantee you that in the rural areas, it'll be even higher than that, may end up pumping over 60% support. And I think that if you are trying to do the test of, do you have a clear question and a strong mandate, then that would be yes and yes. And so that the hope behind that is that it's going to prompt a national discussion, that the federal government is going to have to take the vote seriously. They can't just shrug and say, yeah, whatever, I know that you want to change the Constitution, but we're just going to go do other things. The opinion of constitutional experts is that now, because of various Supreme Court precedents that we've had, it obligates the federal government to take it seriously and to negotiate in good faith. And so how that plays out after this is going to be interesting to see. I suspect from the straw poll of what we see in Calgary that the rest of the country better get ready, because the conversation's beginning.
We know, and trust me, I believe you when you say that. The constitutional precedent from the Quebec case that the Supreme Court weighed in on is very clear. And I know we're going to be talking to Bill Buick about this later on, who's done a lot of work on this as well. At the same time, I also am not holding my breath, given that just earlier this year, for example, Justin Trudeau sat down with Jason Kenney. Jason Kenney said, hey, we're having these Senate elections coming up. We really would hope you'd hold off on appointing any. And Justin Trudeau said, well, I don't know. And then a couple of weeks later, Justin Trudeau announces Alberta Senate appointment. So I don't think the federal government, this particular federal government, has shown a willingness to play ball necessarily. And I guess I would ask you, as someone who's led a provincial political party and movement, what would your next move be? You have the referendum, you have the mandate. How would you play that card?
Well, I think that you begin the negotiations, but then you make immediate moves to do what Quebec has done. You say, okay, Ottawa, we're going to collect our own personal income tax. We don't need your help doing that anymore. You give notice to the RCMP that you're going to be canceling the contract and establishing an Alberta provincial police, that we don't need the RCMP anymore. And you tell Ottawa that we'll be opting out of the out of the pension plan, and we'll be creating our own Alberta pension plan as well. Those are things that are completely within our power and control to be able to do. And if the Premier gets the mandate that he has on this, let's remember equalization is a federal program. To get it out of the Constitution requires 7 out of 10 provinces representing 50% of the population to agree. But I think that this would show that the Premier has enough of a mandate to move on the things that he really does have control over. And that's what I would hope to see, because those things will matter. Those things will cost the federal government money, and it will make the other provinces pay attention too. But I think that it would be easy to ignore or put this on a slow train to any kind of resolution without a couple of follow-ups. So I think the Premier's going to have to move on a few of those things.
Yeah, and you're right. It also gives Premier Kenney, I mean, it leaves him with nowhere to hide, quite frankly, because all of a sudden he has this mandate. His base is going to expect him to do something with it.
They certainly will. Although, I suppose he could say that it's not a strong enough mandate. I'm not sure why he would do that. I am a little bit surprised. I want to talk to the 43% of Calgarians who still think that we should be spending $13 billion on Quebec so that they can subsidize hydroelectric power. I'd love to know why they think that.
Who are those people?
It is a good question. Some of them must be federal Liberal supporters, although we don't have that many. Some of them, I would think, would also be those who really do believe that Alberta should play a leadership role in helping its neighbors. I think that if you asked me, do you want to help PEI? My answer would probably say, yeah, I kind of want to help out PEI. But if you ask me if I want to keep on shoveling money to Quebec so they could be hostile to the development of our energy sector, my answer is hell's no. So I think that's maybe the issue, is that perhaps equalization needs to be reformed so that it can support the smallest provinces as it was intended. But it should not be there so that it creates a slush fund to help the federal Liberals win votes in Quebec, which is, I think, the way the 57% who said, yes, we need to get rid of this clause. That's probably how that group sees it.
Hey, I'm jumping in late here, Danielle. Nice to have you on here. And sorry to interrupt you. Andrew, I wonder if he'd mention. I know he has a pretty inflated view of himself, so he probably thinks that the 43% is driven by his Twitter rant that he went on earlier today. But Danielle, I wanted to ask you. You understand Alberta politics better than most, and better than I do. Certainly, we've seen Jason Kenney sort of have a fall from grace recently, and we were talking earlier about how his approval numbers are just really low. And so, what do you think he needs to do, Danielle, to turn things around? I mean, he's not in any imminent danger of getting removed. It doesn't seem. He seems like he's got 7-8 months until the UCP convention. So, what do you think he can do to win over Conservatives who might have a negative opinion of him right now?
I think the thing he needed to do, but he's disinclined to do it, is he needed to take a little more of a strategic and surgical approach to how he imposed some of the new measures, the vaccine mandates, the vaccine passports, the restrictions on various businesses. There's an appetite for that in Calgary and Edmonton, undeniable. There's no appetite for that in rural Alberta. And I got the impression, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I got the impression that the harshest measures in Ontario were not applied across the board, that there was a little bit more of a surgical application. So I think that's been one of his mistakes. The other mistake that he's made is just flip-flopping, that when he makes up his mind, he's 100% dug in. And then when he changes his mind, it's 180 degrees in the wrong direction. And then he digs in again, 100%. And people just don't trust now. They don't believe that when he says that, what he's saying now is, oh, well, we'll have vaccine passports only until the first quarter of 2022. I think a lot of people are saying, yeah, I'll believe that when I see it. What I would have liked to have seen him do, as I would have liked to have seen him, if he was going to go down the pathway of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, then he needed to do some of the things that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis did. One of the main things he did was focus protection and make sure that our seniors in nursing homes are taken care of as the first priority. He needed to have early treatment options. We have no early treatment protocol in any province in Canada. The treatment protocol is, gee, go home, and if your lips turn blue, go to the hospital. He could have been a pioneer in saying, we don't think that's good enough. We're going to make sure we have early treatment. And he could have made sure that we had monoclonal antibody treatment, which is approved by the WHO, so that anybody who did get hospitalized would know they were going to be taken care of. That's where I think he went wrong, is that you can't say, okay, all the restrictions come off, and then we're going to do precisely nothing. He had to do something, and I think that's where he ended up with the problem. I don't know that he'll change focus now or change direction now, but that's part of the reason, is that he raised expectations pretty high that he was going to go down the path of some of those red states, and then he didn't deliver on it, and that's why he's got such big problems.
Danielle Smith, president of the Alberta Enterprise Group. Always a pleasure. Thanks so much for your insight and analysis, Danielle.
Yeah, thank you. We'll talk again.
All right, we'll talk to you soon. And let's now go to some breaking news to our decision desk, William Macbeth of True North, who's been following the results very closely. I understand we have a key race to call, William.
Yeah, we True North, based on the fact that I got 182 of 259 polls reporting Jyoti Gondek leading with 45% of the vote to Jeremy Farkas, we can project that Jyoti Gondek will be the next mayor of Calgary, and that what was polled to be a very close election race within a couple percent ended up not being actually that close at all.
Well, obviously not the result a lot of our audience was hoping for, but what do we take away from this? I mean, was this just a rebellion against Jason Kenney? Was this a rebellion against Jeremy Farkas? Was Jyoti Gondek actually offering something that people wanted specifically, or was she really just the natural successor to Naheed Nenshi to a lot of people?
It's interesting. I think there's a mix of reasons for it. You've talked about some of them. Nenshi did not endorse Gondek formally, but he did spend his final moments on social media as mayor going after Jeremy Farkas and telling people not to vote for him. The other thing that's interesting is, as I mentioned earlier, and I think Danielle mentioned too, the Political Action Committee, with by far the most money in Calgary, was the one being backed by the public sector unions. I just did a quick tally, and their endorsed candidates or others who are on what would be considered the left look like they're on pace to win about 11 of Calgary's 15 city council seats. So the mayor and 10 more seats, which would actually be a pretty big ideological shift on Calgary City Council. And the other thing that I think is interesting is, of the four or five incumbents who are running again, at least three of them are on track to be defeated so far tonight. We're seeing some councillors who have been there for nearly 2 decades actually losing to challengers, which is very unusual in a municipal election to see an incumbent actually lose. So a lot of factors going on at once right now, and certainly not a slow night. And Andrew, I can also just give a quick update here in Edmonton, with 93 of 228 polls reporting Amarjeet Sohi at 44% and his nearest competitor Mike Nickel at 27. I think we're pretty close to being able to call Edmonton's mayor for Amarjeet Sohi as well.
How is the referendum looking in Calgary so far?
Actually, it's gotten a bit better for the yes side. It's climbed up a few points. Again, with that 182 polls reporting, 58% of people voting in Calgary have said yes to the equalization referendum, and 42% have said no. Now, of course, we don't know what's happening in other parts of Alberta. Perhaps something dramatically different is happening in Edmonton, or perhaps in the smaller cities, or in the north or the south. But based on the results from Calgary, it looks like Albertans are voting for change when it comes to equalization. And as a matter of interest for anybody trying to tell the time in Alberta, right now it looks like Albertans are voting to keep standard time, and they are voting 53% no to moving fully to daylight savings time. So that's the other referendum issue that maybe isn't getting as much attention as the equalization one.
Well, if that fails, the time actually of this right now goes back an hour and the polls reopen, don't I?
Yeah, maybe they can wage an extra hour of campaign.
Yeah. If it fails, we go back in time. Candice, what do you make of this? That on one hand, you've got Calgarians that are saying, yes, we want to stop bankrolling the rest of Canada, but at the same time, also voting for the left of center mayoral candidates.
Well, it just goes back to Vitor's point, which really does stand out to me, which is that, just because you have a view for Canada of sort of limited government and you don't want Ottawa to have its fingers in your pocket and you don't want the legislature in Edmonton to be able to, push left-wing ideology through the workforce and in schools, that doesn't mean that you don't want nicely paved sidewalks and roads being cleared when there's a big snowfall. Like I understand the idea that people would want a more activist local government, and that people who are sort of the free market conservative side need to do a better job of really framing their issues and talking about ways that they can make their communities better. Maybe conservatives need to take a more community centric approach to municipal politics. That's all sort of ideologically. As far as the individual candidates, it seems a little odd to me that so many people run in these elections. Like, why not just have one sort of small C conservative candidate in Edmonton and one in Calgary to sort of rally all the people of that sort of persuasion behind? So it seems like a little bit of a mixed bag. But interestingly, the whole daylight savings fine. I wanted to make a point about this because a couple of years ago, California voted an election to get rid of daylight savings times, and they voted in favor of it. It was 60% voted yes, let's get rid of it. 40% let's keep it. And they never changed it. Nothing ever happened. So sometimes these things happen and they don't really go anywhere. And I think that's the same case with the fluoride in the water. It seems like Calgary's been having this debate for a really long time as to whether or not there should be fluoride in the water. It seems like an issue that just won't go away. I read Colby Kosh had an interesting article in the National Post saying that it's been 64 years and 7 plebiscites, and the city is still debating the merits of putting fluoride in the water. Now, this was interesting because before we went live, we're having a little bit of our own internal debate here at True North about what we all thought about fluoride. As you know, I'm from British Columbia, and so according to Colby Kosh, and I think he's usually correct, he says that 98.8% of the population of British Columbia lives with unfluoridated public water. So I don't think that there's any reason to put fluoride in your water. I think that a better idea is to just tell everyone to brush their teeth, right? And instead of having this sort of like paternalistic nanny state measure of just like forcing people to have fluoride by sneaking it into their drinking water and making people ingest it, which doesn't have the desired effect. The idea is that it helps with your teeth. Ingesting it might not be the best thing. And it's like, well, maybe it's because I grew up in a jurisdiction where nobody has fluoride in their water. So maybe it's just me.
Well, and I grew up in a city in which the water is, and as long as I can remember, has been fluoridated. So I never really thought that was a controversy. I just assumed that was part of the standard municipal water treatment. It wasn't until there was some city councilor who wanted to get rid of it and everyone treated him like he was a kook that I realized that this wasn't unanimous across the board. So I do think where you were born and whether you grew up on fluoridated water does weigh heavily on your take on this. How's that referendum shaken up, William? I realize we skipped past that with all of our excitement about daylight savings time.
We did. Well, I can tell you that the pro-fluoride forces have been victorious, with 61% of Calgarians voting to restore fluoridation to their water, 39% voting to remain unfluoridated. So that's a pretty clear win there for Team Fluoride. And I can say that I just did a quick check. And I think at this point, True North is going to be able to project that Amarjeet Sohi will be the next mayor of Edmonton, with 152 of 228 polls reporting well more than 50%. Amarjeet Sohi has garnered about 44.67% of the vote to Mike Nichols' 26.58% of the vote. So Alberta has elected 2 progressive mayors tonight in both of their big cities.
Well, quite an interesting development. Just to go back to the fluoride referendum for a moment. So this is a resounding victory, but as I understand it, this has happened before.
Candice alluded to it. The history of fluoride in Calgary is very interesting. We've had endless referendums on whether or not we want to have fluoride in our water. And the last referendum that was held, actually Calgarians voted to have fluoride in the water. And then a few years later, City Council, all on their own, decided to remove fluoride from the water, even though voters had voted to have fluoride in the water a few years before that. So who knows what the outcome will be. Just based on who's won the city council election tonight, I don't see a large number of principled libertarians getting elected to Calgary City Council, which tells me that they're going to be going ahead with the fluoride in the water. So for any of you looking to avoid that, you might want to start stocking up on your bottled water right now.
Or just filtered water. No need to bring plastic into it. But yes.
Yeah, the plastic's going to be illegal soon if the federal government has its way. Yeah, I think if you're just tuning in, Flo Rida has won the Calgary election with 61% of the vote. So it'll be a great. Oh no, sorry, different results that we're mixing up there. So William, just I mean, based on what you've seen, you and I talked about this a little bit earlier in the show. The breakdown of what we could extrapolate from Calgary's results. Are you still holding firm with what you said before?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that it is a pretty big win for the unions and the left supporters of the left here in Calgary. They have flipped a number of seats that were previously held by more conservative councillors. The polling from a bunch of different polling companies showed it to be a really close race between Jody Gondek and Jeremy Farkas. The outcome, though, of the mayor's race wasn't close at all, 15 or 16% difference between the first place and second place candidate. And you have to wonder how much $2 million of PAC money from the unions, the public sector unions, played into the results that are happening tonight.
Very well said. Before we go to our next and final guest for the evening, Candice, how can people support True North?
Well, we really appreciate everyone tuning in, and it's a lot of fun to do these live shows. We like to do them almost every opportunity we can. We did one on election night. You probably remember we did one on the debate night. We did one on the night the election kicked off. We really like doing them. We also have full lineup of podcasts. We put podcasts out every day. The Candice Malcolm Show, the Andrew Lawton Show. We have a couple of other colleagues who do videos and all that kind of thing. You can get news on Canadian on Canadian politics, immigration, foreign policy. We have an entire team, a newsroom, and we really appreciate everyone who tunes in, who supports us. If you want to support the work we do, if you enjoy watching us, if you want to keep it going, you want to be a part of True North and the vision that we have for independent media in Canada, please head on over to donate.tnc.news. We don't take any money from the government. We're true independent journalists. We don't think that journalists should get money from the government, and we take a very principled stand against that. So if you support our idea for independent journalism in Canada, you like hearing the other side of the story, you want to see news that we do fact-based news, but we also have a conservative, small c conservative editorial position, which is really rare in the media lineup. You see a lot of people on the left, center left, pretty much dominates the entire media spectrum in Canada, and it really has an impact on the country, even as we see tonight with a bunch of left of center candidates winning. If we want to move that needle and push more conservative culture, party elements of that is having independent media and a small c conservative editorial position. So again, if you like True North, please head on over to donate.tnc.news. Consider giving us just a very small donation, whatever you can. It all helps. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. And I will say, on the point of not being funded by the government, a lot of the time people say, well, the government doesn't want to give you money. It goes both ways. We don't want to receive government money. And I think that's what sets us apart, is that we do not want to be beholden to the government and to the government narrative. And I think over the last year and a half with COVID, that's been especially clear how important it is for there to be truly independent voices. So whether it's covering Alberta elections, we're here for you, or national elections, or even all the things that happen in between. We're standing by in just a couple of moments. We're going to go to Bill Buick, who's the Executive Director of Fairness Alberta. But I want to talk a little bit about the stakes of this referendum, because I admit I generally speaking try to have very low expectations, because it's very easy to get disappointed with the political culture being what it is from time to time. But here's the challenge. This is a non-binding referendum. So a lot of what happens next comes down to how Jason Kenney and the Alberta government play it. And let me ask you, Candice, we've talked about this with Danielle, with Vitor, with other people that have come on here. How strong a voice do you think Jason Kenney is going to be in Ottawa going up against Justin Trudeau with this referendum result, if things continue to develop how it sounds like they are, at least in Calgary?
Yeah, well, I think we can let Bill Buick kind of speak to that when he comes on, because he'll probably have a better understanding. But from what I understand, that there's already a lot of partisan politics at play when a provincial conservative premier meets with a federal liberal prime minister, and there's a lot of posturing, a lot of talking points, and just partisan politics. And so when Jason Kenney has, and what Albertans are giving, if the referendum goes the way that we think it will, based on the Calgary results, that this is an added level of leverage, because it's not just I'm a conservative, you're a liberal, and we're gonna duel it out. It really is. This is the will of the people in Alberta. The people in Alberta don't want this in the Constitution. They have told us this. It's not just like a very small, 1 or 2%. It looks like an overwhelming majority of Albertans have said that they don't like the system of fiscal federalism. They don't like the idea of subsidizing to such a great extent Quebec, when Alberta has its own fiscal problems and having its own issues with the recession and the decline in the price of oil and all the problems with pipelines. You had a disastrous government with the NDP and Rachel Notley. You've had a disastrous federal government with the Liberals in Justin Trudeau, and both of those compounded together has just been so heartbreaking for so many in Alberta, seeing their industry go in decline. And Calgary, once just a great prospering city, sitting with a quarter of its commercial space is vacant and unoccupied. So, what I think what this really does is provide a message to the elites that are in control in Ottawa, to Justin Trudeau and his inner circle, that it's not just a matter of we're conservative, you're liberals. This is the will of the people in Alberta, and I think that they would be very well advised to listen and at least look into it. And then Vitor made a great point earlier about how some of the other provinces might want to reconsider the whole arrangement when it comes to federal transfers with health, because so many provinces have been hit so hard by COVID. All of them, the whole country has. So the idea that we're so limited with a rationed government-run, rigid government-run healthcare system might be something that we finally have the maturity as a country to look at and get past the cheap little talking points about us being superior to our American neighbors, and say, let's look at the healthcare system objectively, not just comparing ourselves to Americans, but saying what's the best system that we can have, and working on together. And I think that this is all the components of them. It's all aligned here. So I think that that's something that's going to be interesting in the coming years, Andrew.
Yeah, and just on a related note, I mean, it doesn't have to do with the referendum, but on the note of healthcare, there's actually a conference next weekend in Calgary being put on by our friend Danny Hozak and the Economic Education Association that is dealing with that question, because we've seen how healthcare is kind of the linchpin of a lot of things that are happening right now, whether it's the pandemic response, lockdown measures, some of the things you were just talking about. I'm going to be speaking at that. Danielle is going to be speaking at that. And I think that's going to be something that's very interesting moving forward, because, again, this has been a climactic moment for Alberta, for Albertans, but you have to talk about what comes next. And something Danielle Smith mentioned earlier really stuck with me. She had talked about the idea that Albertans oftentimes want to help their neighbors. They think, okay, we've got a bit of wealth here, we've got a bit of money, we can afford to help PEI. The problem with equalization is that the application of it is not just to help provinces in need. It actually helps provinces structure their entire fiscal system around the idea of dependence. And that's especially true in Alberta, or in Quebec, rather. Quebec is the second largest province in Canada. Quebec has industry. Quebec has a lot there. Quebec could very easily be running its affairs in such a way that it doesn't need that steady stream of money from Alberta, but they don't. So the result is Albertans subsidizing Quebec Hydro, subsidizing Quebec infrastructure, doing all of these things. So we'll delve into that now with Bill Buick, Dr. Bill Buick, I should say. He is the executive director of Fairness Alberta and joins us now. Bill, this is something that you and I talked about in the past. I know you spoke about it on Candice's show as well. It doesn't change the Constitution. election if this referendum goes the way it looks like it is, but it does give a strong mandate. Now, explain for people that don't know how this non-binding referendum can actually have some real force in Ottawa.
Sure. I have a column I wrote for the National Post that I encourage people to have a look at. And it basically says, I mean, hey, someone asked me today, thinking they had a gotcha moment. So if Quebec had a referendum to increase equalization payments, should the federal government pay attention to that? And I said, of course. I mean, anytime a province cares enough about a topic to have a referendum that they pass something on, clearly that's significant. And how could a federal government just ignore any province who passed a referendum on something like that? So, of course, they wouldn't, though, because they wouldn't want us opening up that can of worms, because, as you pointed out, it's basically entirely stacked in their favor. So, but the problem is that, so there's a common sense notion that anytime people speak out in such a way that the federal government should pay attention. But then also in 1998, and it's extremely frustrating because there's some constitutional law scholars who, who wouldn't trust the constitutional law scholars' interpretation of this. They keep insisting there's just no significance to the 1998 Quebec secession reference to what we're talking about. But the Supreme Court was very clear in a very long reference case that they were asked by the federal government. Yeah, there was the main focus was how could a province trigger a separation and breaking up the country. But they also put in a few very clear general principles that when there's a legitimate expression for a desire for change from any province, that there's a duty for the federal government and the rest of the provinces to consult on it. And so the wording certainly didn't help the numbers that we're going to see tonight and then in a week when they're official. But the wording is there because it made it a tougher threshold, so that when that passes, it triggers these duties beyond what the typical political duties would be to address a problem when a province expresses it that clearly.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned political duty, because I would say irrespective of how that Supreme Court reference case is interpreted, there is a political duty, but obviously a legal duty has much more force. What needs to happen, I guess, politically and legally for Jason Kenney and for his government to advance this? I mean, you have the results, you have the numbers. What's that next step?
Then, to me, the next step, and it's something we've been working on at Fairness Alberta for a little while now, is getting Ontario on board. Saskatchewan's already said they're on board with pushing for equalization reforms. The other two big contributors are Ontario and British Columbia. And politically speaking, it might be the case that Alberta and Saskatchewan tend to be a little taken for granted by one party and kind of written off by the other parties. So nobody really wants to go out too far on a limb for us, unfortunately. And that's something, we're trying to get around through this referendum and through the advocacy we're doing. But really, the serious reforms are going to come when it's folks in Ontario, when the politicians in Ontario start hearing about this from people, when the politicians in British Columbia think, or if they just take a good hard look at this and say, hey, we have a fiscal problem here in our province. It's not that our taxpayers aren't paying enough taxes. It's that the federal government is taking so many of those taxes and sending them to Quebec and the Maritimes. And Quebec in particular is the one. So to me, the next step is to, everybody's got a heads up now that this is coming. Before you go too hard on trying to demand the changes, let's see how much support we can get in Ontario and British Columbia. That's 70% of the country. And a whole bunch of the governments are won and lost in Ontario and British Columbia. If we can get those folks angry about this, frankly, and pushing for these changes to happen and realizing just how much the federal government is taking of their taxes, giving to other provincial governments, then that's the time I think we can really push for serious changes and have success.
Vitor Marciano was on the show earlier, and he made a comment that I can't really disagree with, that the only people that have been vocally against the referendum are political science professors. Now, I don't think they make up 43% of the population of Calgary, which seems to be, last time I checked, the number that voted against this. In your experience talking to people, what are the primary objections? Are they people that object to the specific question, or are they just people that dislike the process, dislike some of the players involved, and aren't really engaging directly on that idea of whether they support or oppose equalization?
I haven't run into or heard from, or we get hundreds and hundreds of people commenting on our posts because I've been very kind of active on this front. I haven't really seen anybody say they disagree that equalization is seriously flawed and needs to be changed. It is a combination of thinking it's just a publicity stunt by the premier, or which is, a lot of people have said, oh, he's just doing this because he's unpopular right now. He's like, well, no, this was something that was pushed in 2017. That's when I started supporting it. And it was in the platform in 2019. This has been a long time in the making. And it's people that are just cynical about the process, cynical about the type of question. And yeah, I'm a little surprised at how many academics have come out so full-throatedly and just, from all different angles. It doesn't mean anything. It's too radical and it shouldn't be phrased this way. I mean, kind of pick a lane. Is it insignificant and unmeaningful and symbolic? Or is it something that's going to rip apart the Constitution and cause these massive quarrels that are going to maybe leave Alberta in the short end after a while? They don't seem to be too logical. They just seem fixated on very, very narrow looking at this and not understanding that it's ultimately kind of symbolic, but it also has a piece in there that triggers a threshold which will force more meaningful discussions and negotiations.
Yeah,
And
I think
so
you're very right there.
think,
I've paid a close attention to this, not as close as you, as you've been in the trench on this, but I've not come across a single person who said, well, by golly, I want to give Quebec more money. I've not met that Albertan. They might be out there, but I have not met them or have not heard from them. Bill Buick, Executive Director of Fairness Alberta. Great work on this, and thanks for coming on tonight.
Yeah, my pleasure, Andrew, and happy to come on in the future as we start to push this cause in Ontario and British Columbia and across Canada. And I encourage everybody to go to fairnessalberta.ca and see what they can do to help us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Bill. We might need to see some fairness offshoots in the days and weeks to come. Fairness Ontario, Fairness Manitoba, Fairness Saskatchewan, and so on. Just as we wind down our time together, I want to bring back our All-Star True North team here, Candice, Malcolm, and William Macbeth. William, I'm not sure, do we have any new results on the referendum, on any of the municipal elections, or Senate as well is one that I think deserves a little bit of attention?
Sure. I can say that 2 more municipalities are reporting equalization referendum results. The 2 southern cities of Medicine Hat and Lethbridge. Lethbridge is voting 58.5% yes on the referendum equalization question, 41.5% no. Medicine Hat, though, voting 70% yes on an equalization referendum, 30% no. So a decisive win for the pro-equalization reform group right there. And then in terms of the Senate elections, I mentioned before that the 3 candidates endorsed by the Conservative Party of Canada are leading. 2 of them are leading by quite a lot. One of them seems to be 7 or 8% back, though. And not too far behind them are a couple independent candidates. One named Doug Horner, who was a PC cabinet minister for 150 years here in Alberta. He comes from a storied political family. And another one who has backing from both former Mayor Naheed Nenshi and Premier Ed Stelmach. So this one, a doctor, seems to be spanning sort of the ideological divide. The People's Party of Canada is also running a slate of Senate candidates, 3 Senate candidates, and they're earning in the 4 to 5% mark, which was sort of what the PPC, I think, was earning at the national level in the last federal election. But it looks at this point like the 3 Conservative Party endorsed candidates are in the lead.
That's interesting. I know the PPC had in some Alberta ridings managed to nab 13, 14, 15% of the vote. And I know a couple of those ridings candidates actually are now the ones running in the Senate, one of them notably Nadine Wellwood in Banff Airdrie. So I guess the PPC was probably hoping it could replicate that and build off of it, but it doesn't sound like that's happening.
No, and I think it's just a function of there isn't as much attention on this Senate election as I think there was on the federal election. Maxime Bernier did a cross-country tour, True North, of course, reported from the ground on his election night event, but there was no PPC campaign that Maxime Bernier spearheaded here in Alberta during this Senate election. So I think they fell back a bit from where they were in the federal campaign.
Candice, we've covered a lot of ground here. What are your thoughts here as we wrap up?
Well, Andrew, you had a funny line a minute ago when you were talking to Bill. You said, "By golly, I don't think we should give Quebec more money," and it reminded me of our friend Norm Macdonald, who passed away a couple weeks ago. I know he always used that funny line. He'd say, "By golly." So I don't know if you were doing a Norm Macdonald impression there or not, but
I wasn't trying to be, but as I was saying it, I was thinking of him. I realized.
No, I like that. No, this is I like doing these live shows. I've enjoyed it. I always learn a lot. I think having a roster of Albertan guests come on and sort of give us the perspective from different parts of the province, and it's so important. We kind of get wrapped up in federal politics and always focusing on Justin Trudeau and the latest shenanigans out of Ottawa. And it's important to recognize that there's a whole other country out there that doesn't see eye to eye, doesn't view things the same way as the people in downtown Toronto and out in Ottawa do. So it's refreshing for me, and I enjoyed it. I like reading the comments as well. I always get some good laughs and some interesting content as well. So thanks to everyone who has been commenting. Thanks to everyone who has chipped in to help support True North over at donate.tnc.news. Really appreciate it. And I guess we'll just have to stay tuned because, we have sort of unofficial results. I think that the mayoral races are pretty down pat, but with regards to the referendum on equalization, some of those other questions, we'll have to do a deeper dive in the coming days and weeks. But I think it's been great. Really appreciate everyone who's been watching and Andrew for hosting. We have a whole behind the scenes team that I don't want to forget. So thank you to the team behind the scenes that are helping us out. Really appreciate it. And thank you. It's been a great night.
All right. Well, on that note, my thanks to you, Candice, for putting this all together, and everyone else, and William for coming on and staying on top of the numbers, to the team, and more importantly, well, not more importantly, but as importantly, to all those of you who are tuning in. This is a lot of fun, and I know all of us like talking to each other and kicking back and breaking down what's happening in politics, but I don't think we'd be doing it as fervently without an audience. So thanks to all of you for tuning in. Cover what's happening in your community and let us know. Obviously, we haven't been able to cover every town and every county and every village. Some of them are not posting their results online, but if you go to tnc.news in the coming days, we'll be reporting stories that are emerging as we see some more of these numbers. So thanks again to the on-air, to the off-air, and to those of you watching wherever you are in the country or around the world. I'm Andrew Lawton for True North. We are signing off. Have a good night, everyone.